Hello everyone, welcome to the SMITE Comprehensive Guide to Osiris. This is sort of a request by Metal Effect. As I stated with the Hades Comprehensive Guide, or at the start of that one, this was specifically a request on how to fight against Osiris, so I will also be discussing that as well, but I will also be approaching this from the perspective of Osiris as well. Now, before we get into building Osiris, there are a couple of points about Osiris that I really specifically want to talk about. The first of which is the fact that his auto attack chain has the last 2 hits be AoEs. Now, what this essentially means is that, assuming that his attack chain doesn't get interrupted, he is getting about 50% of his attacks as AoEs, right? This is fairly significant because this is a big reason why he's built as an auto-attack warrior. There are other reasons besides this, but this is one of the bigger ones, and this also does affect how we might approach building Osiris as compared to your average auto-attacking warrior. Alright, now, with that out of the way, let's talk about his abilities, because Fragmented is really interesting as a passive, because you have a lot more control over this than I think occurs to a lot of people. Now, as he uses abilities, he burns pieces of himself, and each missing piece gets him some additional mitigations. You can see here the percentages. This will eventually stack up to 16% physical mitigation and 8% magic mitigation, but once you hit the 8 missing pieces, you only have 6 auto attacks to take advantage of this, really, right? However, there's nothing stopping you from, say, using 7 abilities. And keep in mind, this is just using the abilities. You don't have to hit the abilities for this to work. But anyways, you can throw out the 8 abilities and then just, I'm sorry, not the 8 abilities, the 7 abilities, and just not use additional abilities. If you're boxing someone in lane, for instance, and they're not running away from you actively, then you simply auto-attack them with the 7 fragments missing, and then when they try to escape, then you use your last ability, trigger the complete fragmentation, which gives him basically hastened katana effect for 6 auto attacks, and this allows him to stick to enemies when they're trying to escape, which is a really excellent way of using him, and a really good Osiris player, as a result, is very hard to get away from due to this. Alright, but there are a couple of other really interesting points regarding Osiris very specifically that not a lot of people really think about. One of these is Sickle Strike. Now, Sickle Strike is a very low power ability. This is part of the reason. This is another one of the reasons why he is built as an auto attacker. But interestingly enough, it does have a mere 6-second cooldown. Now, the reason that's interesting I will get into with the items, because this allows him, even as an auto attacker, to really bring out substantial amounts of damage with items you wouldn't normally expect an auto attacker to be able to bring to bear here. But again, we'll get to that in a little bit. Secondly, we have Spirit Flail. Now, this itself, the Sickle Strike, is a decent slow. It's 20% slow for 3 seconds. It's okay. Considering it's a 6-second cooldown ability, that's actually fairly good. But you can double that duration, essentially, and increase that percentage of slow by hitting Spirit Flail. Now, what's really interesting is that when you land the Spirit Flail, it does, in fact, technically refresh the slow and then doubles the strength of it. So if you wait a second or two after Sickle Strike, then Spirit Flail, then you're effectively refreshing that slow. I generally try to shoot for 1 second wait, because it takes a second for a Spirit Flail to actually come out and be used and sort of land, so to speak. So if you wait 2 seconds, you run the risk of missing that window, right? So I recommend actually counting out 1 Mississippi or 1 alligator or whatever your personal 1 second word is, and start forming that habit, right? Because that will effectively nearly double the duration of the Sickle Slow. Thirdly, and this is very interesting, Judgment Tether, which reduces the amount of damage tethered enemies deal to Osiris. Now, this is fairly important because I've seen a few new Osirises use this and just expect them to be taking less damage. It doesn't really work that way. The enemy does have to be tethered for that damage reduction to be taking place, okay? But this is another very impressive ability, especially in regards to boxing matches where you can tether them to you, take anywhere from 10 to 20% less damage, and stun them at the end of that time, right? Unfortunately, it is a 4-second duration, which has its pros and cons. Obviously, that's 4 seconds of reduced damage, but then it's 4 seconds you have to wait before they get stunned, which there are going to be times when you appreciate the 4 seconds and times you wish it was faster, right? I do sometimes wish this had the ability to be manually triggered again to end it early. For the stun, I do wish that sometimes, but I think that would make him a little too strong. Finally, the most important, interesting point is his ult. Now, there's a couple of things to note about this ult. First off, it's his most damaging ability, right? We have 80% scaling here, we have 75% here, which is a good amount of scaling, and then we've got a mere 45% here. Obviously, Judgment Tether doesn't do damage, so it doesn't scale. Yet another reason he's not built as an ability-based god. But Lord of the Afterlife is also his only leap, which puts Osiris in an interesting predicament every time he wants to fight. And this is actually Osiris's main flaw as a solo laner and as a god in general. Lord of the Afterlife doubles simultaneously as his best initiation and his only consistent escape. Now, given that his abilities do slow the enemy and his tethers can potentially stun, he does have some options for potentially getting away from enemies, but this is not very reliable. First off, slows do nothing against an enemy's dash or jump, so if you slow them down and they wait a second or two and then they use their jump or their dash, they're going to probably catch back up to you fairly quickly. Judgment Tether only stuns them if they're within a certain distance, so quite honestly, if they get stunned, yes, you can create more distance, but once again, this is a mere jump distance away, right? So his most consistent method of getting away from people is going to be Lord of the Afterlife, but this is also his easiest way of initiating. After all, if he wants to initiate on someone without Lord of the Afterlife, he'd be throwing his Sickle Strike. If Osiris misses this Sickle Strike, he's going to have a harder time catching up to that person. Yes, he does get a move speed boost with Spirit Flail, and he can probably hit this. This is a decent-sized AoE. But it's just, he's only buffing his own speed. He's not reducing the target speed. And once again, if his chosen target doesn't want to engage with combat with him at that point, they can just use their jump or their dash away to prevent him from following effectively, unless he is willing to commit to the ult to do so. Right, so Osiris's ability to enter or exit fights is very awkward and a bit skill reliant. Again, a lot of this does rely very heavily on Sickle Strike hitting in order to initiate, right, effectively, and even then it's still easy to get away from, right, just as it's easy to overcome his abilities in terms of chasing him, that is also the problem. So Osiris's primary issue as a god is his really awkward ability of getting into or out of fights. Once he's in a fight, he is fine. But getting into a fight or getting out of a fight tends to be a very risky and bizarre proposition for Osiris without the use of his ult. We'll talk about that more with itemization in a little bit, but it is worth mentioning. It's also worth mentioning that this particular ult nullifies all healing for a full 6 seconds, and in fact, this is one of the very few hard counters to Sun Wukong's ult heal. Alright, because this anti-healing is going to last for the duration of Sun Wukong's ult, so if you time Osiris's jump to when Sun Wukong is ulting, which it takes him a couple of seconds to actually launch the ult, then this will prevent Sun Wukong from healing entirely while he's sitting in that cloud. So this is a very interesting point here. Now, it is a good thing for Osiris that this is only on a 75-second cooldown. It does make it a little bit easier to use this as an escape, for instance, which many Osirises do, but this initiation and exit problem is something that we're going to be talking about when not only building Osiris, but also with very directly how to fight against Osiris, alright? Now, when you're building Osiris, there is one primary starter item most people are going to go for. There are a couple of other ones I've seen. I will discuss these, but let's talk about his good old-fashioned usual cast, right? So usually you're going to want to go for Death's Toll. Now, again, he has AoE auto attacks on the second half of his chain, so he gets to heal off of multiple minions. And also, due to this, most gods can't fight Osiris in wave. Very similar to Hades, where he kind of wants to fight in wave. That's really his wheelhouse, because he does heal multiple times from the minions, and he can damage the minions while fighting you in lanes. So there is that very serious problem. Now, there is a slight interesting catch to this, in that if you have something that reduces his attack speed, this becomes much less effective for him, because only half his auto attacks are effectively the AoE, right? Which means if you can delay that, I mean, by the time he really gets swinging, and by the time you're able to build that decreased attack speed, probably it's too late, but it is worth mentioning, right? Now, there are a few gods that can still fight him in wave, and these are primarily gods that, in some way or another, can effectively contest him in wave. Basically, anyone who can heal in wave better than he can. Hades, Bellona, Ratatoskr, anyone with a fully stacked Soul Eater and wide enough range of abilities can do so. Mulan is a great example of this. Once she builds Soul Eater and stacks that, she can actually contest Osiris mid-wave, if she wants to, right? For a lot of gods, though, it does require an item, but there are a few. Again, Ratatoskr, if he's built the Healing Nut, and even then that technically classifies as an item, so we'll pass over that, but there are plenty of gods that have natural self-heals that operate off of minion damage. Hades and Bellona are standouts, Bellona being able to basically Death's Toll better, right? Nike can do so as well, because her auto attacks are AoEs, if of course she's choosing to build Death's Toll. If she's not building Death's Toll, that doesn't really apply, but a Death's Toll Nike can in fact fight Osiris in wave, alright? People like that can directly contest Osiris mid-wave, but beyond that, most other solo laners are going to have to wait until they get the right items in order to actually contest him in lane. Again, I mentioned some other ones that are really good at fighting Osiris mid-wave once they get their items. Ratatoskr with one of his healing acorns, and Soul Eater is very difficult for Osiris to out-heal, right? But that takes a little while, so you just basically have to not fight him until you get to that point. Same thing with Mulan. Once she gets that Soul Eater, she's good to go, but before that, she has to be really careful and not fight him in wave. So that is something of note. Because his AoE is only the second half of his chain, therefore only being approximately 50% of the time, Osiris gets out-sustained very quickly without building a lifesteal, and there are pitfalls to building lifesteal on Osiris that you have to be aware of when building it. Not that lifesteal itself is necessarily an incorrect choice, I will get into that, but you do have to be aware of certain caveats to how Osiris operates and how you personally prefer to build, alright? Now, like most auto-attacking warriors, hell, most auto-attacking solo laners who are melee, once he's built Death's Toll, he really doesn't need to necessarily be building any sort of serious damage after the fact. A lot of the times, it's best to build some protections as your second item. Now, again, this goes back to how I prefer playing in the solo lane, where I don't build my second item. I don't start that. I get stage 2 teleport and buy a whole bunch of potions and a health chalice, right? I buy mixed potions and a health chalice. The reason why I do this almost always on Osiris is very specifically because I really want to see who my laning opponent is, so I'll know what protections to build. I don't want to be starting, say, Berserker's Shield if my opponent is a surprise mage. That's not going to work. So you are going to not necessarily commit to any specific second item until you've at least seen who your laning opponent is. Now, back to that point, if your laning opponent is physical, obviously, as I just mentioned, you're going to want to build Berserker's Shield. There are a number of great reasons why. Obviously, attack speed is a big one. We have physical protection. We've got a little bit of physical power going on here, but most important for Osiris is this extremely useful Berserk status, right? 10% damage mitigation on top of whatever damage mitigation he's running from his passive goes really well. Consider where I mentioned earlier that you can box with 7 fragments missing and maintain a consistent 14% physical damage reduction? Yeah. Well, and I'm using physical damage specifically because your laning opponent is physical if you're building Berserker's Shield second, but that good old 14% damage mitigation with physical plus the 10% damage mitigation from this passive means when you're low on health, lo and behold, you're getting essentially 24% damage mitigation until you use your next ability, which is really hard to overcome for a lot of opponents. Okay? Very difficult indeed. Now, the magic protection version, before I go on to the third item, is obviously Shogun's Kusari. Now, Shogun's Kusari, obviously, you've got the attack speed, but also the movement speed is really nice, and you do get a good bit of health here, right? But with the MP5, Osiris's abilities aren't high in mana cost compared to a bunch of his contemporaries, right? His abilities, comparatively speaking, are quite a bit cheaper. He's not in as dire of a need of the blue buff with Death's Toll and his low cost of abilities. Can he still run out of mana? Obviously, of course, right? But his mana consumption is a bit lower than your average warrior. So once you build Shogun's Kusari, again as your second item if your laning opponent is magic, losing your mana buff, if that happens, isn't as big of a deal. It's very easy to recover from because you're, of course, restoring mana from Death's Toll, and you've also got this MP5 going on here. So you're really in a great position overall to not need that once you get this, right? But these are your basic 2 options for very specifically that second item. But your third item actually depends rather heavily on what your opponent is building, kind of. Let me be a bit more specific here. You have to look at your opponent and look at your opponent's build and figure out if they're healing enough or if they're going to heal enough where you need Toxic Blade. Because right at this particular point, keep in mind that Osiris's only sustain is Death's Toll. If the enemy, for whatever reason, is either going to be sustaining more than you or has sustain built into their kit, then you need Toxic Blade, because you want to make sure you are sustaining just as much, if not more than them, and Toxic Blade goes a really long way to helping with that. Alright? And this is going to depend, because, say, for example, a Nike, right? She doesn't have sustain built into her kit, so you would need to check her items. If she's building Soul Eater, or if she's feeling spicy and built Death's Toll, or she's going for Aussie or something like that, then yeah, you need Toxic Blade. If you're against Hades, there's just an automatic Toxic Blade. Just automatically. As another example, right? You're fighting against Ratatoskir, Toxic Blade bad. He's very likely going to be picking an Acorn that heals him, and very likely he's also going to be packing Soul Eater in the near future, so probably Toxic Blade there too. You may, at this particular point in time, this being your third item, you'd be able to see what he's doing. If for some reason he isn't building Sustain in solo lane, then you wouldn't need it, but most Ratatoskirs in the solo lane do, and I say this because, again, Ratatoskir is a particularly scary opponent for Osiris in a lot of cases. Once Ratatoskir builds up those items. And just basically anyone, Bellona is another great example. If Bellona has Death's Toll with her hammer swings, she actually out-sustains Osiris in wave. This is actually why she can fight Osiris in lane. And as a very direct result of that, you would want Toxic Blade against Bellona, right? So this is generally the sort of criteria you need to ask yourself before starting your third item. Is the laning opponent out-sustaining me, or do I expect them to? Toxic Blade is also something you would want to build if you see your laning opponent is a hunter, say, and they're building Devourer's Gauntlet. Yeah, you would want Toxic Blade for that, obviously, right? So that is a possibility, and Toxic Blade isn't a bad third item to build here because it does offer you some penetration, so it is going to help you punch through whatever physical protections your laning opponent has built, and it gives you a really substantial increase in attack speed. There's not a whole lot of items that offer you 30% attack speed. There are some, but even Berserker's Shield, right, that's only 25%, so it's a really nice boost to your attack speed, which will, of course, increase the amount of times Death's Toll procs, which means more sustain for you indirectly. So this is one of the possibilities, but what if the laning opponent doesn't out-sustain you? What then? Well, you've got really two choices. Now, my personal preference here, if the laning opponent isn't out-sustaining you, is to grab the Executioner and then run the Ferocious Executioner glyph, right? Do some bonus damage to them. Every time the Executioner, the Ferocious Executioner's proc is up, you can absolutely win whatever boxing match, and that's a very scary and intimidating thing for a lot of laning opponents. But if you prefer, because this is also a viable option, you can also go into Chin Size. Now you'll notice something interesting about all three of these items, right? Which one of these two, Executioner or Chin Size, is down to personal preference. By the way, really quick before I get into the interesting point of these three items, I tend to build Executioner if I have two other physical damage sources, so that way my reducing the enemy's protections helps them too. Typically this is my jungler and my ADC, not always, but if I have like a 3+ physical comp, I usually lean towards Executioner because that's going to help them out. If for some reason I'm one of only 2 physical damage sources, I'm going to go for Chin Size as my third item here, okay? But I want to actually really quickly point out the really fun thing about all of these items and why they're so nice to have on Osiris. All three of these proc on auto attacks, which is of course the point, but because of his AoE back half of his attack chain, this also means that in future team fights, this means that you could be reducing the healing of multiple enemies. You could be reducing the protections of multiple enemies, part of the reason why I like Executioner. You could be dealing multiple percentage of health damage to multiple enemies with your AoE auto attacks. So there's, well, Toxic Blade is scenario specific, but between the Executioner and Chin Size, even if you don't base that on the same decisions I do, which is, you know, how many physical people you have on your team, neither of these are a wrong choice here. Alright? Now you may be wondering, oh, Professor, what if I wanted Aussie? Another great option, and something that can work. But the problem with Aussie that I have found personally is that due to the tendency of solo laners to need or want protections in some variety of way, your power isn't usually going to be high enough where Aussie is going to be healing you for that much. Sure, when the passive triggers, that'll heal you for quite a bit, and if you choose to play a more aggressive Osiris leaning a bit more heavily on damage, then yes, Aussie can really be effective for you, especially if you do have Berserker's Shield, because Aussie is going to activate almost right after Berserker's Shield does, so when you get the 10% damage mitigation boost, you're also, right afterwards, pretty much, going to be activating Aussie's passive, which will help you heal up past that point again. Right, and they even have very similar internal cooldowns, 15 seconds here and 15 seconds here. They actually have identical cooldowns. I thought it was slightly different for some reason. But anyways, and that combination works extremely well. But if you're going to be building Aussie, if you're going to commit to Aussie, you really need to be keeping in mind that you'll want to lean a little bit more heavily on damage than you normally would, which has its risks, because again, Osiris has a really hard time disengaging. So if a battle begins to go south, whether it's a boxing match or a team fight, if things start going south for you, you're going to have a really hard time getting back out of the situation that you've got yourself into, which is a bit of a risk. So going a more damaging Osiris can be very high risk, high reward. He absolutely can slap people around and dominate games. But because of how hard it is for him to disengage and retreat, it can be a really bad plan against the wrong team comp. Generally speaking, there is no right or wrong team composition to do this, because on the one hand, the team compositions that are high in damage, you'll be able to do more damage to and heal more off of, because of course they're not going to have the protections, they're going to be taking more damage from you. So building Aussie and going a little bit harder on the damage means you're going to be healing more and dealing more, but you're also at greater risk of dying. Whereas a tankier composition, they're not as likely to kill you because of course they don't hit as hard, but you're also not going to be healing as much or dealing as much damage to them in turn. So there really is no like good team composition to run a damage Osiris basically in the solo lane. That's going to come down to your preference, but when you build Aussie at the third item, you're basically committing to that. And the nice thing about Osiris here with this particular conversation is that you don't have to make your decision right away. You can wait until your third item. It's only once you've committed to one of these items, and even with Toxic Blade or the Executioner or Chin Size, you can still build more into damage if you want to. The Aussie is just a very specific commitment, because if you're going to be building tanky Osiris, then Aussie really isn't going to do as much for you as one of these other three items. Again, Toxic Blade is situational, so we're going to pull that out. If you're going tanky Osiris, Aussie isn't going to pull as much weight as the Executioner or Chin Size would, right? So you can build Aussie here and it can be very effective, but you're making a commitment to a higher risk game plan, right? And you have to be prepared for that. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through the items. But your fourth item is obviously going to be your other protection item. Whatever one you didn't build earlier, you would build now. Again, as usual, we're going to assume that the first one is physical protections, so we're going to be going for the nice, delightful magic protections as our fourth item. And now we're talking about our fifth and sixth items. And this is where you will basically be pulling a plan off based on what you built as your third item. This is sort of the pivotal point from your third item. I usually build the Executioner, so my fifth item is usually going to be Chin Size here. And then my sixth item will usually be some form of protection, because I'm more fond of protections. Now, why Chin Size specifically? Right, well, as I mentioned before, we already have the AoE auto attacks, so we're already reducing the enemy's protections. Furthermore, Chin Size damage here, the physical damage that's based on a percentage of their health, that is affected by protections. Therefore, using Executioner as my third item means I deal more damage with Chin Size passive, along with my auto attacks in general. And then, of course, like I said before, I usually finish up with some form of protections. My favorite protections being a Spirit Robe, because once again, the damage mitigation under hard crowd control is really going to help you out when you have fragments missing and you've got Berserker's Shield, right? That's a lot of potential damage mitigation, which is lovely. Again, also we have a 15-second internal cooldown here, which doesn't really coordinate with Berserker's Shield or Aussie, because those are health triggers, and this is a crowd control trigger. Totally different. But just kind of keep that in mind. But this is something I'm really fond of building on Osiris as my last item. Alright. And again, this is under Executioner as my third item. If I've built Toxic Blade, then my fifth item is going to vary quite a bit. Generally speaking, if I have 3 or more physical allies, including myself, right? If it's a 3-man physical composition, which most of them are, once again, jungler is usually physical, I'm physical, and the ADC is usually physical, I will usually bust out Executioner at this point instead. I'm very fond of Executioner on Osiris, as you probably can tell. And with that being very specifically said, I am very fond of this. Now, for Aussie, still Executioner, but the last item changes, right? If you built Aussie and your fourth item, I'm sorry, not your fourth item, your fifth item is Executioner for the increased damage, then your last item is probably going to be something else that's going to deal fairly substantial amounts of damage. Now, what this happens to be is going to depend partially on the situation and partially on your personal preference. As an example, I have found that Stone-Cutting Sword, I mean, with 50 physical power, that is 50 more damage on your auto attacks, and it decreases physical protections by a flat amount, so it goes really well with Executioner, and you can be a really devastating protection reduction lunatic, really helping out your team by making the enemy hideously susceptible to physical attacks, which can really help your team out. But maybe you want to double down with some delicious lifesteal, right? Maybe you go into Bloodforge for 75 power and a little bit more physical lifesteal, and a really nice passive that will help you keep up with enemies even better, right? Maybe you feel like you want Odysseus's bow, which is a surprisingly effective item on Osiris because each of his AoE auto attacks count as separate hits, so if you're fighting in a large enough group, then this will trigger a lot more often than I think a lot of people are prepared for. It's a really great little time there. It's very interesting. Or maybe you want to go Archival if the enemy team has a lot of auto attackers. Great option here. You're getting increased power. You're getting, you're reducing their attack speed. And again, this is all under Aussie very specifically. You have a bunch of flexible options, but the last item is generally going to be some form of power, or at best, a hybrid item. For example, I have been known to grab a nice Shifter's Shield, which gives you some power early on, and then when you need the defense, it busts out the defense, right? But this is a good hybrid item even with Aussie that's not going to reduce your damage too much. In fact, with Aussie, the only item that isn't giving us power in some way is Shogun's Kusari, and that's because for a magic protection item, the attack speed benefit at 30% is just too sweet a deal to pass up, right? So that's very specifically what's going on here. Alright. But now we talk about Death's Toll. Do we go with Death's Embrace or Death's Temper? And the actual answer to this, again, depends on whether or not you built Aussie as your third item. If you built Aussie as your third item, you're going Death's Temper here, because you want the increased attack speed so you can, trigger the lifesteal more, right? But more importantly, because all but one of your items is giving you a decent amount of power, the Death's Temper passive actually makes more of a difference for your auto attack damage. However, if you did not build Aussie as your third item, you're going to want to go Death's Embrace, because you're building, very likely, a little bit more heavily on the health portion of the deal, especially if your last item is something a bit more focused on health, right, your HP. So you're going to be healing more through Death's Embrace than you would otherwise, right? Because again, you are building a tankier Osiris. And keep in mind, additionally, that the Executioner here isn't necessarily the only thing you need to build. There is an alternative that I have been known to do, right? Just because I'm fond of it. I have also found to be very effective, depending on the situation, Void Shield, and then splashing in as my last item a nice Talisman of Energy is also really nice if you want to be a really tanky Osiris. And in fact, last year, this is how I preferred to build Osiris, would be... Let me construct this really quick. Last year, it was... Of course, the starter items were a little different back then, but Death's Toll, and then I ran... Berserker's Shield wasn't the same back then. I actually used Shifter's Shield back then. But, going with what my old build used to be and adapting it for the modern day, Berserker's Shield here, go for a spicy little chin size, assuming they didn't have sufficient amounts of sustain. If they did, I would obviously be building... let me throw this in here really quick. If they had plenty of sustain, I would be building Toxic Blade instead. Grab some Shogun's Kusari. Grab a delightful Void Shield, and then finish off with Talisman of Energy, and this was a really effective build back in the day, just updated to the modern day, obviously. That allowed me to do a decent bit of damage, help out my allies, and be really tanky, and this still to some extent does work today, but the reason why I've switched to a bit more aggressive with the 5th item Executioner, or Chin Size, is because right now with the meta as it is, there is a bit more of a reward for aggression, but this is a very effective build, especially if your support isn't doing particularly well, and your team needs a bit more tankiness on the team. You can bust this out nice and late in the game when you can check what the support is doing and make that adjustment accordingly, right? Which is, again, one of the really great things about basically auto-attack gods specifically, is that it's very easy for them to check out what's going on and adapt sort of on the fly. Something that ability gods can do, but not quite as well, right? There's a couple of items that auto-attackers have access to that gives them a bit more diversity. Now, I did want to talk about some surprise items that are unusually effective on Osiris that you wouldn't expect for him to be able to use because he's viewed as an auto-attack god. Now, a lot of this relies very heavily on the fact that his first ability, the Spirit Sickle or whatever it's called, has only a 6-second cooldown, and as a result there are a handful of interesting ability-based items that can really make good use of an ability with a nice 6-second cooldown. First is, if you decide you want to do something a little differently, maybe the opponent has a disarm, maybe you're fighting Bellona and she's disarming you, which is definitely a problem. You can go into Gladiator's Shield, because damaging an enemy god with an ability, that ability deals an additional 15 plus 30% of your protections. That is a 6-second cooldown, which is a very low cooldown. So every 6 seconds, plus Spirit Flail if you're using that as well, which obviously it would be, you're really busting out a large quantity of damage through Gladiator's Shield. Alright, it's not going to help your sustain if you have Death's Toll, but what if you instead built Bluestone Pendant, which for very similar reasons also works very well with Sickle Strike? Right? So it's not actually that bad, although it is a risk. I'll talk about that a bit, but there is a risk here, where you go with this instead, and you go fairly heavily on the damage for Osiris, and using Gladiator's Shield and a few other key items that give you some impressive ability-based damage. Now, continuing on with this train of thought, you would still, want Shogun's Kusari as your 4th. Again, I am assuming in this particular instance that your laning opponent is physical. If your laning opponent is magic, you swap Shogun's Kusari and Gladiator's Shield, right? It's just that simple. And then you could build very effectively the Crusher, and then finish off with a surprisingly effective Heartseeker. Again, your abilities deal an additional 3% of the target's max health. That is an additional 3% plus, depending on how much health they have, damage. 3% damage on a 6-second Sickle Strike. Say that's 6 times fast. Right? This surprisingly works extremely well with Sickle Strike, because you can use that constantly, and even then, you can evolve Bluestone Pendant into either the Brooch or the Corrupted Bluestone, and be equally as effective. Corrupted Bluestone gives you increased protections and attack speed, reduces enemy attack speed, which, if I am going to go for this build, I'm going to be going Corrupted Bluestone if the enemy team has a lot of auto-attackers or a heavy amount of damage, but otherwise, if they're tankier, Bluestone Brooch. I've said this before about Bluestone, but it's my general rule of thumb for that. But either one works, in all honesty, and this really can break out a large and impressive amount of damage. Now, the Crusher is very important here, primarily due to the fact that Asi itself is very specifically auto-attacking. Now, you might be wondering, Professor, why not go for Soul Eater as a 3rd item, or possibly even as a 2nd item? Well, all throughout the past 2 days, I have been experimenting variously with a couple of different options for this build, because the risk of this build is, as you've probably figured out, how late you're building your sustain. Again, Osiris does not have any sort of built-in sustain, so it is riskier for him to build this way. It does definitely heavier damage, right, throughout the match. You've got Bluestone procs. Instead of healing yourself, so that's more damage. Gladiator's Shield is going to be adding more damage to your Sickle Strike and reducing its cooldown, and then as you build up other protections and stuff, that can really hit hard as well. And you've got all of that. But the problem here, primarily, with the... very specifically with the ability to sustain here, is, at least with Soul Eater, is, save this for a second, again, going back to this, Sickle Strike does very low damage, even with higher power. And of course, again, Judgment Tether doesn't do damage at all. So trying to utilize Soul Eater as a healing item works in the short term, but come the late game, you're going to find you're not healing enough to really make that worthwhile. Okay? That is the primary issue with that, in my experience. So, in order to actually heal an effective amount, you have to rely on Aussie. And so, since we also want to be doing ability damage, we build the Crusher, which will give our abilities additional damage and increased attack speed, which helps us out quite a bit, right? So we do have that benefit as well. Now, there is one final variation of this particular build that you can absolutely run if you want to use Bluestone Pendant, but you want to be a tankier Osiris. I don't want you to see this and say, well, damn, you know, I love Bluestone and I think it's really good on Osiris. Isn't there something I can do that's tankier? Sure there is. Now, again, the meta doesn't reward this quite as much. Right now it's a bit more of an aggressive meta. Doesn't mean it won't work. Just be careful. But for this, and again, we do have to make up the sustain somehow, and this is going to seem like a very odd decision. In early game, it can be a bit difficult to pull off, but in the long run, it can work surprisingly well. But what I'm fond of doing, and again, this is something I used to do last year, well, a variation of this last year as well, would be Stone of Gaia here to give you your sustain. Now, this isn't going to be quite as effective. This is primarily basically restoring you between boxing matches, right? And again, something I haven't mentioned yet, but is something very important to mention, is that Osiris with Bluestone Pendant obviously does not have the same kinds of sustain as Death's Toll Osiris, and so Osiris, while he still doesn't mind fighting in waves, it also is something he has to be careful with. In fact, when you're fighting in waves, if you're not consistently hitting your opponent with Sickle Strikes and refreshing the Bluestone Pendant procs, you're probably going to lose that fight, right? But back to the point really quick. Stone of Gaia, which, again, you are trying to poke the enemy very consistently with your Sickle Strikes for Bluestone Pendant damage, so you're going to be pulling a lot of minion aggro, and we're trying to build a tankier Osiris, so we can't use Lifesteal. Soul Eater isn't really going to work because, again, we're not going to have the power, and we're not, you know, doing that damage with the abilities that we might otherwise want. And another problem with Soul Eater, by the way, is that you don't always use your ult for damage. Sometimes you use it as an escape, and since your ult is your hardest hitting ability, that's a lot of potential Soul Eater healing, just going down the tubes as an escape, right? Anyways, back to the point. So Stone of Gaia is better than you would expect on Osiris, because again, we do get that passive damage mitigation, and our next item in this particular instance is going to still be Gladiator's Shield, right? And then we go with the delightful Shogun's Kusari, and then at this particular point, I used to build a nice hefty bit of dual protections. At this particular juncture, usually nowadays I would build Mantle of Discord, and then finish off with maybe some damage, right? Maybe I'd go Chin Size, which I was fond of doing, but maybe you want to really double down on the protections. In that case, you would be totally fine with building Spirit Robe. Maybe you want to do a bit more, you know, ability and auto attack damage, but you don't want to commit to the anti-tank version of, you know, basically good old Chin Size, right? Maybe the enemy team is abnormally squishy and you think Chin Size isn't going to be as effective as, say, the flat penetration and raw power output of the Crusher. When I say raw power output, I mean the passive, right? Maybe you want that, right? another possibility. Maybe you want a little bit more physical protections and some power, bust out Shifter's Shield, right? There's a variety of things you can do here. And again, you'll notice that really the last two items of Osiris are once again very flexible, right? It's more of what you feel you need in the situation. I've been known to bust out a nice late game Witchblade because the enemy team had a lot of auto attackers, and that's just what the situation called for, right? Or using my growing favorite Midgardian Mail, same thing. So it really does depend on the situation and a little bit on how you prefer to play Osiris in general. So we do have that, right? Now, finally, the conversation about animosity. Is animosity viable on Osiris? I'm going to be very, very honest. Viable, yes. Recommended, no. Why is this? Well, primarily due to the fact that, again, Osiris has a really hard time getting out of situations without using his ult. And as a result, your first 4 levels as Osiris are a particularly risky time to be alive, especially since in the current meta, junglers tend to gank at approximately level 2 or 3. So Osiris can find himself in some pretty deep trouble, and in fact, in a lot of situations, even if I ultimately wound up doing well throughout the match, and I, did really well regardless, a lot of the times, as Osiris, even if I was expecting the gank, I would still tend to die to that first gank, because again, Osiris has a really hard time getting out of sticky situations, at least until level 5. So a lot of the times, I would die early on and then make a comeback after the fact. Something Osiris is, fortunately for him, fairly good at, right? But you do have to sort of keep that in mind. Now, the issue here with this is that even after that first gank, whether you live or die, Osiris is going to be pushed under tower or farther back, either way, unless his jungler comes in and saves him in time, which is a risk. So with Bluestone Pendant, you have the damage output to make a comeback. With Death's Toll, you have the sustain to make a comeback. You don't have either of these going for animosity. So it can be a very risky proposition where if you take a tumble in that first gank, you're going to have a much, much harder time coming back, because unlike the other 2 starter items I've mentioned here, you don't have that option. Now, what I am going to say very interestingly is if you really want to go animosity, and there are situations in which you do want to go animosity as Osiris, don't build benevolence until level 15. Just go straight to animosity. Why? Because the interesting thing about Stone of Gaia is you can get yourself a really nice amount of health, some max health regeneration, and HP and MP5 here. Yes, it's going to cost you most of your gold at 1400, and then you can spend the last 100 of your gold on additional potions to help you sustain your way through. But basically, you are heavily banking on sustaining your way through those first couple of waves until you hit level 5, running all the way up to Stone of Gaia, and then just running to Gladiator's Shield, Shogun's Kusari, etc., right? Now, as a result, obviously, with animosity, you want to be building tankier anyways, but what do I recommend build-wise, right? I mentioned earlier that Death's Toll was my favorite way to play him, but why? Well, the short answer is it's the least risky way to build Osiris, right? Like I said, there are some people who can out-sustain him even in that circumstance. I mentioned some of them earlier: Bellona, Hades, Ratatosk Gear after a certain number of items, Mulan after Soul Eater, etc. But at the end of the day, a really big deal for Osiris is ultimately that to not build Death's Toll, to go with either Bluestone Pendant or to go with Animosity, can work. And it can work really well, especially Animosity in a standard comp. The enemy team is only expecting magic damage out of the mage, you bust out an animosity late game, and suddenly the enemy team has to readjust their defense slightly to now account for this new influx of surprise magic damage. It's not a ton of magic damage, but a lot of the time it is enough to force a mild adjustment in their front line's protections, right? So it can be very impactful in your average game. The problem is, of course, is again that Osiris early game is fairly weak without Death's Toll, and as like I said, without Death's Toll, I tended to die at the first gank and then crawl my way back to recovery after the fact, because of course Osiris has a hard time disengaging, unless I was literally standing under tower when the gank came, which I'll talk about that a little bit more when you have the match to watch, and I'll talk about that in more detail then. But it is a very serious problem for Osiris, is that his early game without Death's Toll can be very high risk. And if your enemy out-sustains you because you've built Bluestone Pendant or you're going for a late game animosity build, this can really hurt your early game, and you really have to bank on the late game. You have to farm safely. You have to, take what you can get, and you have to try to avoid boxing if you fall behind. Can they work? Yes, absolutely. But it is riskier. Because, again, if you're wrong about who your landing opponent is or how they're going to build at the first couple of the first couple of fights, you can find yourself in trouble. Particularly, it's primarily a matchup thing. If you're not expecting sustain and they come in with tons of sustain, you see Sun Wukong rolling into lane, and you're like, damn it, I was expecting a sustainless. I was expecting Amaterasu with her really low self-heal. Right? That's what I was expecting. Now I'm in trouble, right? That kind of thing. It can work, but it is risky. If you're in communication with your jungler, again, if you're partied up with your jungler, this changes a little bit, because you can communicate very directly with your jungler that, hey, I'm building this particular build. My early game's going to be a bit rough. Can you be a bit aggressive in the early game on ganking the solo lane, and then, after my third item, you can wander off and go slap other people down a little bit more aggressively, right? Because generally speaking, once you get to Gladiator's Shield, you're at least in an acceptable position, unless you've really fallen far behind, right? So, with that being said, how do you deal with Osiris? How do you fight against Osiris? Well, first off, if he has Death's Toll, don't fight him in waves. Alright, if he doesn't have Death's Toll, dodge the sickle, poke him out, count to 6, because that is literally his cooldown. Rinse and repeat. You can theoretically outpoke him in any situation, and in fact, when he's got Death's Toll, your best option is consistent poking. Alright? But you also have to keep in mind that Osiris has very impressive poke himself. If he's built Bluestone, then that poke becomes... he'll probably win the poke war. He's got a 6-second cooldown that can refresh that Bluestone proc on you, and you're not going to have a good time. So you want to box him very consistently, because you're not going to win the poke war. But if he's got Death's Toll, you got to poke him to keep him at an acceptable health level, and then just not box him in wave. And then when he's low enough, or you see your jungler coming in for a gank, then you engage in a boxing match, right? The problem is Osiris is unusually sturdy due to his passive, and he's very difficult to get away from if he doesn't want you leaving due to his kit. But if you can catch Osiris off guard, and you start winning a fight, unless he uses his ult to escape, you've probably got him dead to rights. Again, it is very difficult for Osiris to disengage cleanly from a fight he doesn't want. So if you can start winning your fights, you're probably going to kill him, because he won't be able to get away from you as easily. So, you're basically looking to, with Death's Toll, you want to poke him down between waves until he gets to a low enough level of health that you're confident you can win that boxing match, and then you just wait until after the next minion wave dies, and then go in hard on that boxing match, and again, he'll have a bit of a harder time getting away from you, because he has a relative lack of disengage. If he's got bluestone, then you don't want to poke him. You want to full-on box him and do as much damage as possible and just try to sustain your way through the boxing match. Now, it's a little bit better for you to do this in wave if he hasn't got Asi, because the way Osiris will be operating is obviously even if he doesn't want the fight, a lot of his stuff, including again his auto attack chain, tends to accidentally hit you if you're close enough to him, which sometimes he wants and sometimes he really doesn't. So if you fight him in wave, again assuming you have sustain, you can usually out-sustain him in wave. So basically it comes down to the question of what starter item does he have? If he has Death's Toll, avoid the wave. If he doesn't have Death's Toll, if he's going for an animosity build or he's using bluestone, try and fight in wave. Try and fight in wave if you've got sustain. If you don't have sustain, then try to box him and out sustain him that way. It really depends on what form of sustain. For example, Hades, like I've mentioned earlier, would want to box him in wave. So would Ratatoskir once he gets his Acorn upgraded, and Soul Eater. Mulan would also be fairly interested in boxing him in wave because she can heal off of the minions as well. However, for other solo laners whose heal is not dependent on the wave, a great example is Sun Wukong. Sun Wukong would really want to box him not in a wave, even if he was building Bluestone Pendant, because Sun Wukong's healing does not care about the presence of minions. So it would be better for Sun Wukong to box him in a one-on-one, as an example. So that is generally sort of the condition here to fighting Osiris. Now, again, it is very difficult to fight Osiris in lane. He is, again, very sturdy. He tends to build sustain really well. But stick with these, and you've got a decent shot at this. Again, junglers can make this a bit different. I don't talk about junglers in the solo lane enough. The really problematic thing with Osiris is that a lot of junglers see him as difficult to gank for a very good reason. He is. He's got, of course, the damage mitigation from his passive. He's got the ability to jump out using his ult if he really needs to. And while his slows and his tether don't always save his life, they do make chasing him a pain, right? Eventually, yeah, you will catch up to him, but due to his kit, while he can't necessarily completely stop you from approaching him, he can make it a pain in the neck, okay? Which can be more time than a jungler might want to spend in lane trying to gank someone, right? So it is interesting where Osiris is not... This has only recently been changing, by the way, this perception, because obviously, again, he has a hard time disengaging, but he can really draw out that process into a much longer time sink than the jungler might want to invest in, right? So you basically just have to respect whatever his starter item is. If he ever builds Aussie, avoid waves like the plague, because that's a worst case scenario for you, at least for that point in time, until you can build anti-healing. Okay? So yeah, that is Osiris building, and that is how you would want to approach Osiris, right? As an opponent. And I'll talk more about this in the Conquest match, but with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.